G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our webinar series. And today's webinar is From Limits to Growth to Earth for All, Towards a Wellbeing Economy. I'm excited to introduce our special guest just shortly, but I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Ngunnawal country and pay my respects to elders past and present. The Australia Institute also runs webinars at least once a week, and days and times do vary. So you can check out our upcoming webinars if you head on over to australiainstitute.org.au, and you'll find them under our events. And just a few tips for Zoom to make things run smoothly this morning. You can type in questions for Sandrine using the Q&A box. You can also upvote other people's questions and make comments on them as well. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat or we'll kick you out. And lastly, a reminder that this discussion is live, but it's being recorded and it'll go up on our YouTube channel later today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I'm really excited about today's webinar, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by Sandrine Dixson-Declève. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So Sandrine is co-president of the Club of Rome and divides her time between leading the Club of Rome, advising, lecturing, and facilitating really difficult conversations. She's the executive chair of the Club of Rome program Earth for All and recently co-founded the Systems Transformation Hub. Her most recent book, Earth for All, A Survival Guide for Humanity, sets out a roadmap for a better future. I'm so delighted to have you here with us today, Sandrine, and you're in Australia for about 10 days, I understand. For people who aren't familiar with the Club of Rome, I thought we might just start with the kind of work that you do there and what the purpose is, just to give people a bit of context to start us off.
Absolutely. So the Club of Rome was founded in 1968. The reason it's called the Club of Rome is because it was founded by an Italian, Aurelio Pace, who was at the time actually had been CEO of Olivetti in Italy. And he had traveled all over the world and realized that there was something that was going to start explode. He could feel a tension globally, and we think this is in the late 60s, early 70s. I mean, beyond the fact that we had the Vietnam War. This real thought that actually we were going beyond the Earth's limits and that we needed to start to think through population growth and some of what he called the human problématique, the key questions, the blind spots that humanity was starting to really hit in terms of their impact on the planetary boundaries. And there wasn't the planetary boundaries science yet. What he wanted to do was bring together predominantly men, I must say, and predominantly from the West, but decision makers, business leaders, to really think through this human problématique. And so the Club of Rome continued to be an exclusive club of decision makers, thought leaders, many of them economists and scientists, but in the beginning, predominantly business leaders and former policy leaders, thinking through these key challenges, publishing, and in particular, working on one of the first big commissions, which was the Limits to Growth, asking a series of MIT scientists led by actually Dennis Meadows at the time to think through this big human problématique and to look at the interrelationships between social and environmental tipping points.
So it's now, I think, something like 50 years since that was published. So how do you see the state of play at the moment globally, particularly when it comes to climate change and these limits to growth?
So what's interesting and quite depressing is, and I'm going to show my age, I guess, is, I was born in 1966, and I think through those 50 years of knowledge that actually we were hitting limits and the fact that we didn't acknowledge the fact that we are. And that's where we are. If you look at some of the main scenarios coming out of the Limits to Growth, and I was showing this yesterday at ANU, you can see that the major tipping points are now in the 2020s. This was predicted by scientists using some of the biggest computer models, because in those days, computers were huge, the mainframes, and they already had the algorithms to say and to analyze that we were hitting limits. So what I'm feeling is, okay, we lost 50 years. there is a sense of urgency. Those environmental tipping points are before us. We know we've surpassed 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. We know that climate change is upon us. We've seen some of the greatest hurricanes, multiple hurricanes, hitting the U.S. Just recently. We've seen the fires here, the Pantanal and the Amazon are continuing to burn. There are direct. We've seen actually the greatest heat waves that we've ever had, and we've surpassed over the last year more than about 5 days of 1.5 degrees. So we are in a deep emergency situation. And yet, what myself and the leaders at the Club of Rome and so many others believe is we can emerge. We can emerge from emergency. But we need to make some decisions now. And we need to face the music. It's not going to be easy, but that's where we are.
Yeah. I think that's so important to really face that we are in a shift. Things have changed, and that's where we find ourselves now. The title of the webinar today is really towards a well-being economy. If we look at what we want that shift to be, what does a well-being economy mean, and how is it different from the conventional economy that we're in at the moment?
So already, again, in the Limits to Growth, we talked about the extractive economy. And we've, over the last 50 years, talked about the fact that the neoliberal extractive economy is one that does not really service either the planet or people. You can't continue to extract natural resources, especially when you're moving to 9 billion people on this planet. So how do we shift from an extractive economy and just focus on productivity? A well-being economy is one that starts to take into consideration 3 key areas: the environment, the social, and economics. But then look at what matters within our economy. And what we're seeing actually, and this is for me the biggest case now to really shift towards a well-being economy, is that we see across the globe, well, people are getting poorer, inequality is growing, poverty is definitely growing. Our social tension index and our well-being index has shown that social tension is skyrocketing across the globe. Well-being has dramatically decreased because of climate impacts, but also the cost of living. And this is not just because of COVID. This is also because our economies are servicing shareholder value and they're not servicing people. So what we need to do is seriously consider, first of all, is our economy doing what it needs to do, which is fuel the betterment of people and better life for people, and that all the data is saying no. We have the first generation that's making less than its parents. If that's not happening, then what kind of economic models do we need? And we have enough data to demonstrate that we need models that go beyond GDP, that take into consideration other indicators, and that place a measure, a real metric on well-being. And that well-being can be defined in a variety of different ways. We've got the well-being economies across the globe that are starting to and have shifted in that direction. But we're also seeing many economies across the globe that are realizing, especially post-COVID, that they need to place a value more on the care economy, that they need to place a value more on access to certain services, and that they also need to place a value on the externalities of climate, of environmental impacts.
That's really interesting. So in the Australian context, we've seen this current Labor government, the Treasurer Jim Chalmers has made a lot of efforts towards measuring what matters, as he describes it, something that he first announced at one of our events, actually. And the Australia Institute itself has done a lot of work around measuring what matters, really going beyond GDP, like you were talking about there, and towards those things like making sure that the role of the care economy is acknowledged. It feels like Australia has really had a focus on that under this current government. But at the same time, that emergency aspect and the externalities associated with climate change is really much less pronounced and often going in the wrong direction. So very recently, the Environment Minister here approved 3 new coal mine extensions. And Australia, obviously, globally, even though our domestic emissions are huge per capita but small in global terms, we have massive fossil fuel exports. And I think the idea is really for that to expand in future years. So where are governments, including Australia, at when it comes to really acknowledging that this is a climate crisis that we're in, and there's actually some hard things that need to be done, that we're not doing that hard work alongside some of the other good work that is happening.
So let me first start by commending Chalmers and his work. I think it's really important that when our leadership stands up, that we commend them for at least looking at the right questions and unpacking them, even if in the end the government doesn't adopt them. So that's the first thing I want to do. The second is that I want to really point to the great Sharon Burrow, who's one of your own, having led the International Trade Union Confederation and having worked with Sharon because she was based in Brussels for many years. And it's under her invitation and also the great invitation of Catherine Trebeck that I'm here, who's been doing all the work on the WellBeing Economy Alliance. I want to say that Sharon points to something that's very important, and I want to build on this idea of false narratives that we've been fed through the fossil energy industry. The first false narrative, and this is one that really Sharon has honed in on, is the jobs. This narrative that actually we're going to lose so many jobs if we shift out of the fossil energy. And in particular in coal, if you speak to most coal miners, Sharon traveled all over the world, went to Poland, etc., had very specific conversations with the coal miners. And it's very clear, as long as coal miners can continue to work, and by the way, most of them don't want their kids to work in a coal mine, as long as they have the skill set to be able to continue to work and stay in their communities, that for them is the most important. So point number one, we are not going to lose jobs if we're able to actually shift those jobs into renewables or into a service industry within the energy sector, which we absolutely need. And that is part of the transformation of any sector, which is that you move forward and train people and bring them on the journey so that they can continue to be part of the economy. That's point number one. Point number two, we know that we have to cap and eliminate emissions from fossil energy, full stop, if we're going to meet our climate goals. Everyone keeps on focusing on the bright, shiny things. Let's invest in new technologies. We started with CCS, and CCS continues to be the big, bright, shiny thing, along with hydrogen.
Yeah.
By the way, we were talking about CCS and hydrogen 30 years ago. I started my career in oil and gas. These were the bright, shiny things. We have not evolved in either one of them. And everybody says, oh, it's because of the carbon price. Well, of course, the carbon price, the level keeps on shifting. It used to be that we needed at least $50, then we needed $100. Now we need $150 to $200. So we need to start calling bullshit on that. The third key point is the fact that the energy sector right now is actually pulling out of their net zero targets. BP pulled out just last week. We heard from Saudi Aramco this week in Singapore that actually it's too difficult for developing countries to actually make this transition. But no one is talking about the perversities in the market that continue to enable fossil energy, the fossil fuel energy subsidies, the fact that these companies are making $2.8 billion in windfall profits per day on the back of growing energy poverty. Now, if we started to just tax those windfall profits and put in place a just transition fund, we would already start to have the capital that we needed to truly make the shift. And then the last point is, we often don't talk about, first of all, the investments that are going into renewables, the fact that we're now at price parity, and that we can really take it to the next step. So there are so many false narratives that are being thrown at us. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I'm saying there's a lot of positive possibilities of transitioning both towards renewables and to efficiencies. We are so inefficient in our energy use. And as some of our own politicians used to say when we were looking at climate and energy and the new climate and energy package in the late 90s, the best energy is the energy you don't use.
Exactly. Yeah. It's such a straightforward point, and it's so often missing, particularly in the Australian debate. After the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, when energy prices went up everywhere, we often hear from Australia's, particularly our gas exports industry, LNG, oh, we've got a shortfall, prices are going up, we don't have enough supply. And it's, all absolutely ridiculous, obviously, really predicated on a false narrative, as you were saying. And we really do have to make this shift, essentially, but it's politically difficult. It's actually quite straightforward and simple, as you've just explained what we need to do, but it is politically difficult, I guess. We're coming up to the next COP, and how does the COP, if at all, tackle this side of the equation, the expansion of fossil fuels in particular?
So it's incredibly problematic. The last COPs have been hijacked to a certain degree by the fossil fuel industry. Myself and Johan Rockström, climatologist who I know has come to Australia, and he and I have been working. He's also an author of Earth for All, a Survival Guide for Humanity, already coming out of Sharm el-Sheikh, where we saw that there was a real pushback on any language with regard to the phase out. I mean, we keep on talking about transitioning, but we don't specifically talk about phase out or an end to fossil fuel. Already in Sharm, there was big pushback. Not to mention, by the way, that the COP was hosted by a country that had big human rights violations. Fast forward to 1 year later, we find ourselves in Dubai, the biggest trade show ever. These were supposed to be COP negotiations, and I wrote several op-eds and complaints, actually, around the fact that both Sharm el-Sheikh and also Dubai were hosted by governments that had human rights violations, that in some ways, even though there was some real work by the presidency in Dubai, we did see that, again, we were talking to not only the head of an oil company, but also an oil country and producer. And now we find ourselves in Azerbaijan. And after our pleas, and we sent a letter actually to Simon Steele, who is the Secretary General of, or the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, which is the organization that runs the COPs. We asked myself and Johan Rockström, but also Laurent Stoubiana, who is one of the instrumental leaders of the Paris COP, saying very clearly we need to reform these COPs. First, we need to get back to basics. We need to get back to ambition. We had 195 countries that adopted the Paris Agreement, and we're nowhere near it. We had a 1.5 degree declaration. We have surpassed it, and we probably will hit 2 degrees by 2030. So we are not on track. And yet we have these declarations that have been made and these commitments that are being made. And part of the problem is that we are creating negotiations that in the end are not focused on trying to truly achieve a reduction in our carbon emissions. Instead, we're skirting around the big questions. Fossil energy phase out has been taken off the agenda in Baku. Myself and Johan just last week, and I'm announcing it now, but we haven't officially announced it yet, have said that we will most likely not go to Baku in protest, because we both fundamentally believe that if we continue to go, we're actually stepping right in to one of the biggest problems in truly achieving the ambition that we need to shift the bar. And this is supposed to be the decade of action. So I believe now that we are not using wisely these negotiations, that they have become trade shows, that they have not focused on the most essential, because that decision, and you have reported on it so much around the need to move towards fossil fuel phase out, is not even on the agenda. So how can we actually look at each other and say that we're working on climate change?
Yeah. Just a reminder for those who are joining us, you can type in your questions for Sandrine in the Q&A box, and we'll come to those very shortly. But I've got a few more questions. So what you were talking about there, I think, is really interesting. Again, thinking of the Australian context, where we've still got very clear targets that we're aiming towards net zero by 2050. But we've recently seen mining magnate and iron ore magnate Twiggy Forrest here really call out the BS basically that's associated with these targets, and point out, we're all thinking about net zero in terms of hoping someone else is doing all the actual decarbonisation. And what we need to talk about is real zero and genuine decarbonisation and reduction in emissions. So this conversation isn't happening at the COP, but what about elsewhere across the globe? Is there anywhere that is actually doing this genuine decarbonisation work that countries like Australia, could look to as examples?
So I think it's interesting. There was a real move, I would say, over the since the Paris Agreement to move in the right direction. We were seeing oil and gas companies diversifying. We were seeing more and more investments in renewables. We actually met our targets in Europe. So there were so many good examples. I sit on the board of a power company in Portugal. Every single one of their targets have been met. By 2030, they will be 100% green power. And this is this is EDP, the National Portuguese Power Company. We saw across Europe that most of our utilities were shifting. And the interesting thing is, while we started to see that progress, we're now seeing the pushback. And the pushback for me is what I call the immorality push, because I truly believe that now it's become immoral. What we're seeing is companies that have interest in fossil energy, those that started to see their profit margins go down while they're making those windfall profits that I declared, right, that are not being taxed and refocused, they have now really started to hunker down and say, we will continue to support a fossil economy. And I don't know how to describe it otherwise, except to say it's immoral. On the back of people struggling. And we're feeding them, and excuse my language, total bullshit about the fact that renewables are making their costs go up, that it is the fault of green energy. As you said yourself, if we look at the Ukrainian invasion, it was the gas crunch. And by the way, in Europe, the entire renewables market is tied to the gas market. So yes, renewable suppliers saw windfall profits too. But part of that was the fact that their prices went up, even though they could have kept them down, because of the way in which our market is structured. So there are so many perversities that are continuing to enable, alongside the immorality of some producers who are saying there is no other way. I fundamentally believe that there is another way. There is a way to start shifting capital. Most investors will say the money is there, but it's not going to the right places. And if we keep on putting out the signals, which is exactly what the oil and gas companies are doing, to the market, to the investors, that actually they'll make less profit by investing in renewables or energy efficiency or green projects, and that they should continue to pour their money into gas and oil, then the market will continue to go in that direction. Hence why this is not just about an energy transformation. It's about the signals of our economy. If our economy is geared towards productivity only, geared towards shareholder value only, where we know that 10% wealthiest own 60 to 80% of our economy, which we fundamentally have to shift, then that immorality will continue to encroach in every single decision that we make, including the courage of politicians, because they're on short-term election cycles, to not actually do the right thing because they're under pressure and in the pocket of the oil and gas sector, but other incumbents. I'm very worried about this.
I'm going to ask a couple of more questions, then we'll come to questions from the audience. And I can see a few that are in here already, so don't forget to add yours in. And you can upvote other people's questions. That'll help me to dig out the ones everyone is interested in. We just see so many echoes of that in Australia, Sandrine, and I obviously it's what I'm more familiar with, but I can see a lot of what you're talking about happening in the current Australian context, essentially. And so before we move on, I'll point some people towards I mean, we've measured the number of fossil fuel subsidies operating in Australia. It's about 14.5 billion last year. There's things
And globally, it's in the trillions.
yeah, exactly. We saw all those windfall profits happening. We didn't tax them here in Australia either. The government actually brings in more money from students paying for their university degrees here than they do from the petroleum resource rent tax, our major tax on
and
the
Warren
gas industry.
Buffett, has declared that his housekeeper is paying more tax than he is.
Exactly. So that was the question that I wanted to come back to before we kind of come to questions from the audience, which is the role of, I guess, inequality here, because we have seen post-COVID inflation rise globally. A lot of people are struggling to make ends meet. It's obviously affecting both developed and developing countries, but much more acutely in the rest of the world. Yet we're still kind of not seeing developed countries like Australia really pull their weight. Here we've got a big contrast between our Pacific Island neighbours, who are obviously facing an existential threat from climate change and sea level rise, kind of looking to Australia, looking at our fossil fuel expansion and really wondering how that all works. But here it's really been dominated by, we can't afford to do these things. Energy prices become a big conversation. So how important is really tackling and reducing inequality as part of doing what needs to be done when it comes to addressing the climate crisis?
Fundamental. So our analysis that we undertook when it was the 50th anniversary of the Limits to Growth, and we published Earth for All, a Survival Guide for Humanity, bringing together scientists and economists, showed that the speed and scale of the change with regard to staying within the operating space from a planetary perspective is directly linked to fighting inequality and poverty. I can't speak to the Australian case, although I have many friends who live on the islands and who are also saying to me, by the way, you talk about missing 50 years. We're now talking about the next 10 years having to move off our island, and our ancestors deciding whether we stay with them and we just commit collective suicide, which, can you imagine, what a choice, or we move to Papua New Guinea where we know we're not welcome. I mean, here's the decision-making factor. And I often say, by the way, we could all be refugees, every single one of us, because we now are saying that the climate impacts are hitting all of us. But to come back to that very question, if we look at supposedly the greatest democracy, the greatest neoliberal economy in the world, the United States, where I grew up as an immigrant from Belgium, and I look at the Bay Area and how it has totally played out why neoliberal extractive economies don't work. Yeah, it worked during the 80s when it was the Boons Day. It worked when we had the big dot-com boom. But now we're seeing no trickle down. We're seeing a housing crisis because no one can afford to live in San Francisco. We're seeing a city that used to be the great gem of the United States now being called Poop Town alongside Calcutta. And we're seeing more homelessness, suicide rates, mental illness, people walking in the streets in their pajamas than we've ever seen in our entire lives. This is an American dream that has turned into an American nightmare. And by the way, we're being told in Europe by the new Draghi report that we need to go into more of a neoliberal American model. And I say to that, you have the perfect example of what could go wrong. This is the moment to start thinking through how we can do things differently. We have enabled inequality by the immorality of the uber rich, who hold so much of the wealth and do not redistribute it because they don't pay taxes. And those uber rich, you can call them also the oil and gas company, who also do not take and pay taxes, because we've enabled shareholder value and rentierism and profit to go in the hands of a few rather than the many. Now, you may say to me, well, who cares? Because I'm doing well and I can bunker myself away. And, there is parts of the economy that, like me, can just build big houses and pretend that it doesn't exist. But instability is going to come in so many different ways, and we see it. We see it in terms of the revolt of the people, where people are starting to, first of all, kick you out of certain cities because it's becoming quite uncomfortable. We can see it in climate impacts because we've basically used up our natural resources and thought we could extract ourselves to death and never have an impact on the planet. We see it in terms of pandemics because we are encroaching on our biodiversity and our ecosystems. And therefore, now it's starting to bite back at us because we're getting too close. We will have more climate impacts, more pandemics. And with growing inequality, we are basically creating a nightmare scenario. It is time now to sit up and smell the coffee and say, okay, we've got a choice. All of us, we can become human beings again and come back to our true value of what it means to be human within an ecosystem where our ego doesn't take over, but actually our hearts and our souls become a little bit more anchored into our place in society, both with other human beings and with other ecosystems. Or we can continue to destroy ourselves to death because we are the greatest existential threat.
I'm going to come to questions from the audience now, and I've got one here from Mike Knight. He says, why do we leave undeveloped countries to electrify by themselves when they are the easiest to help as there's little else to change? Could you talk a little bit about, I guess, energy poverty and what we can be doing to help developing countries, by the sounds of this question, essentially leap over fossil fuels straight to renewables where they can?
Yeah. So first of all, I always have a real hard time with using the term developed or developing. We have to remember that actually the global south is most of the world.
Yeah.
Secondly, how do we qualify developing? I don't think we've developed that well, apart from wealth again in certain people's homes.
True.
But to come to the very good question, because the crux of the question is such that absolutely right. I mean, there is no fiscal space right now in the global south to develop in a different way. We have asphyxiated them with high debt, with the fact that their trade deficits are so high because they've been told to continue to push all their commodities and all of their wealth into the global north rather than focusing it on their own country. One of the things that we speak about actually in Earth for All is, first of all, shift the debt burden. So really start to talk about debt. And by the way, you know, most people think it's public debt, but we have to remember that private companies like BlackRock and others own a huge amount of the debt. So we have to get BlackRock to let go of that debt. They're making pretty good returns on that debt. So we need to look at the debt. We also need to look at the way in which we can enhance regional trade so that the region can develop together rather than constantly sending everything, including food, outside of the country while people starve in the country. We need to remember that the best thing we can do in terms of migration and migration policy is to walk in partnership with the global south to help them develop economically, again, in a different way, by investing in renewables, by investing in new technologies that will enable the betterment of people's lives and livelihoods in these countries. And we need to, and this is something that is often not looked at, ensure that women and girls are empowered to, first of all, go to school, because many of them are not allowed to go to school. And secondly, to be part of the whole decision-making infrastructure, because they often at the community level are making the right decisions to ensure the survival of the community, not just of themselves. So there are ways in which we really can work hand in glove with these countries. Now, why is this so important? One is the migration issue, because the more you help a very different type of economic development in a country, the more people will stay there. Secondly, because we know, and this is the selfish part, most of the minerals, most of the new economy is in the global south. So we should be smart enough to enter into joint ventures and to try to work together to actually make those products either in the global south or with the global south so that we can all have access. A development in these countries is good for everyone. It's also the right thing to do, by the way.
On top of that, should make it easier in the end. Peter Martin asked the question about representative democracy clearly failing to address the climate and biodiversity crises. And is there a place for things like citizen assemblies to develop better public policies?
Absolutely. So again, in Earth for All, and I am actually part of this new idea of creating a global citizen assembly, which will be pushed at the next Brazilian COP. But you need citizen assemblies and you need more engagement with the public for a variety of reasons, not only for better decision making, but also to enhance a dialogue with the broader public. We see so much fear mongering. We see so much disinformation. And by the way, a lot of that disinformation is fabricated by those that want us to believe, predominantly the radical right or the radical left, that people don't believe in climate change, that people aren't ready to pay their fair share. We've done a massive survey just recently, which we published in October, and I really urge you to go on our website, Earth for All. You just Google Earth for All, you'll see the Ipsos survey. And it's really incredible to see across G20 countries that most citizens believe in climate change. 71% believe that we need action now. And all of them are ready to pay their fair share. And I add fair because, again, if you see that oil and gas companies are not paying their windfall profits, or that the uber rich, who are the biggest problem in terms of emissions, are not paying taxes, then why the hell would you want to pay anything for climate change? And I fully agree with that. Why are citizens feeling guilty about not doing anything when their governments and those big polluters are allowed to go off free? That is problematic. So the disinformation is really a problem. And coming back to community discourse, coming back to town halls where we can really have dialogues and educate people about what is truly real, how their lives are being faced by real problems, but what the solutions are, rather than the fabrication of misinformation is really important. And I would add one more thing. It was very interesting. I did a Times debate 2 years ago, actually, New York Times, around is an authoritarian government or a democracy better at fighting climate change? And I was asked to debate the authoritarian government. And in the end, we won. And I bring that up because I really had to read up on what my arguments were. And to be frank, my argument was we need an authoritative government, not an authoritarian government. An authoritative government is one that showed itself, for example, during COVID, where it took control where it was necessary, but it continuously was engaged with the public in terms of informing the public of the real risks, what are the possible solutions, but also engaging in a dialogue of how the citizen can be part of that solution. And there's a great example here in Australia, and I cannot remember where this happened, but I remember reading about this several years ago, where one of your water companies realized that water was becoming so expensive that they would have to put up the price, and that probably there would be a big pushback from certain consumers. And they entered into a dialogue, and they also entered into a big savings campaign of how consumers could be more efficient. And just by doing that, they didn't have to put up the price. They were able to save an enormous amount. And not only that, they became one of the most popular companies in that particular community or region. So having dialogue is so important at this time because of all that misinformation.
That's funny you mentioned that because I was thinking about that earlier with one of the other comments you made. So in Australia, we're really familiar with the idea of water restrictions and that if water is scarce, the first thing that you do is reduce your consumption. But when we have this idea from our gas companies that there's somehow a gas shortage, the first idea is importing gas from overseas. It's not what can we do to reduce our consumption. So,
and can I just add to that in the 90s, we published a report with the Buildings Institute for Europe on the fact that actually, if we properly invested in energy efficiency across the European continent, and in particular in buildings efficiency, we could wean ourselves off Russian gas. What did we do instead? Poor decision making. No one listened. We saw Crimea. That wasn't the first alarm bell. For some reason, decision makers continue to think about Nord Stream 2, which was a big pipeline from Russia into Germany. Merkel made one of the worst decisions in her life, and I very much had a lot of esteem for her as a leader in many other ways, but not on this. If anyone blew our climate and energy policy in Europe, it was Chancellor Merkel, because she agreed to Nord Stream 2. She created a dependency on Russian gas, and then Putin thought, I can invade Ukraine very easily, and he did. And so the link between energy and geopolitics is also fundamental, and we have to be very careful there.
The next question I've got is from Susan McMahon, who says, what can Australia do to shift the COP if we host COP31 back to where it needs to be as a genuine negotiation and not a trade show?
So many things. In the same way that I believe that Brazil, even though they are also an oil and gas producer, and I used to be an advisor to Petrobras, by the way, on cleaner fuels, Australia can do the same. Brazil has decided to bring in also the social COP. So now that they're hosting the G20, and we're very actively involved in the G20 Social Summit, which is happening next month, I think Australia, because of also its very important indigenous links, whether these are respected or not by certain parts of the population, but that knowledge, that understanding, that anchoring in the importance of indigenous people, in the same way that Brazil is trying to do the same, the knowledge of the Pacific and the islands. So being able to bring in that knowledge rather than, and I hope that wouldn't be the case, that Australia actually embraces this part of its responsibility and its society and uses that as a real opportunity to unpack some of the really difficult conversations that we need to have about sea level rise, about what creates that sea level rise, a real conversation around oil and gas, a real conversation around what then is the transition plan, a real conversation around we are in an emergency, but we can emerge. And then structures that conversation in a framework which is focused on ambition, in the same way that the Brazilians have said they will not make it a trade show. And I hope they stick to that. Make sure that actually there is also, and this I believe the Australians can build, whether they like it or not, on some of the UK's experience as diplomacy. You need to use this time, if you get chosen, the next 2 years, to build that diplomatic conversation, to have conversations with different countries in the same way the French did before the Paris Agreement, and really lay the framework, the pathways for an agreement that takes us to the next step. We are stagnating, if not backtracking. And I would even say we're backtracking.
Yeah.
The Paris Agreement was laid forward because of unbelievable diplomacy. But also, let us not forget, and I hope that this won't happen in Australia, one of the greatest terrorist attacks we ever saw, 10 days before. And I can remember the conversations because I was actually working for King Charles at the time, and I apologize for bringing this in. Some people may or may not like the king. For good or for bad, one of his qualities is that he fundamentally believes in sustainability and also in climate change abatement. And at that time, there was a big conversation around, should he come to the Paris COP? Obama was asking the same question. All the major leaders were. And I fundamentally believe that there was an anchoring of, one, we are not going to be brought down as humanity by terrorism. Hence, we are all going to show up proud in Paris. Number two, it enabled that sense of humanity to continue across the negotiations. And it's what got us the Paris Agreement. Now, let's not use some type of attack as a way to bring us together, but maybe that deep knowledge that we have no other choice now, but to really unpack the solutions at this time, to structure the conversations so that we focus on actually moving forward and making the right decisions. And maybe that can be the real end to fossil energy COP. Also, having conversations with sovereign nations who are very much dependent on fossil energy, thinking through what their economic dependency means, and figuring out how we can really put in place the right structures to enable that transition to happen.
I think that's a really positive vision for what Australia could do with a COP if we were awarded one. Whether or not we could actually follow through with it, given I think the close links between government and fossil fuel energy companies here, I think is another question. I think it would be really interesting to look at that idea of a phase out and putting some dates like we have around emissions targets against when
Completely.
is the last coal mine going to be approved in Australia, would be a really interesting conversation.
And there is the treaty, the fossil fuel treaty. There's also the
non-proliferation
moratorium.
treaty,
There are so many different, signing up to the treaty, making as many countries do so. Maybe we need to call the Australian COP the People's COP. The Real Planet COP. Maybe people can hold the Australian government now accountable for, if you get the COP, this is what we demand.
Yeah, I like it. The next question is from, where are we? Robert Hinckley, who says about changing the engine of our economy, the corporation. Could we make it so that the duty of directors have to take into consideration more than just the bottom line? Specifically, could we change the duty of directors, which is now to act in the company's best interests, and add, but not at the expense of severe damage to the environment, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the perfect example of how we need to both change the governance models and the business models. The whole shareholder premise is really what's bringing us down, and this extreme wealth that is now being made by shareholders, and they're really holding hostage companies. We've seen time and time again CEOs like Paul Polman of Unilever or Emmanuel Faber of Danone who get kicked out because they're asking for a shift from quarterly reports, for example, a demand that shareholders enable the time to both address social and environmental impacts across the company, that they look at their value chains in a very different way, that they accept that maybe profits will not be as high. And one of the key points that I now make is, let's get real about profits. And this is this immorality issue as well. The first is that we're now seeing enough data to demonstrate, and there have been several reports, that we will lose about 3% GDP at 1.5 degrees globally. Okay? At 10% GDP at about 3 degrees. So if we're going to lose GDP anyway, GDP is a measure of productivity. You could change that last P to profit. If we're going to lose profit in the hands of a few, should we not be demanding that our business models shift so that actually they are value-based rather than profit-based? And I think that that is really the key demand that we also need to make right now, is to come back to an economy that is not only linked to the greenback and to the profit of just certain CEOs, and to remind them that they are actually making money on the back of growing poverty. But that means also completely changing, as Patagonia has, the entire business model. Part of that is shareholder buybacks. How do we as people invest and become shareholders to change the entire business model, Part of that is around returns and shifting from quarterly returns to annual returns. And part of that is just starting to recognize that this is what's killing our existing economy and making it not a prosperous economy for the many, but only for the few.
I can see we've got a few hundred people on the line with us. Thank you so much for joining us. We've got a couple of questions to go. So Mitzi asked if we are looking at a sweep to the right around the world, and particularly so if Trump wins, how can we make any impact on fossil fuel phase out and keeping global temperature rise to its least harmful effects in that kind of a context?
So I think that we are going to see that global temperatures will go up. I mean, let's be real. We're seeing it now. What we're doing is this is the only buffering plan that we have is to start to reduce fossil energy. And I think that we need to, and that's why there's this whole debate around adaptation versus mitigation. I think we need to truly, while we are mitigating, adapt our cities for higher temperatures. I was just in Singapore, and one of the climatologists was on a panel with me, and he was indicating, here in Singapore, you all need to get ready for upwards of 45 degrees.
My goodness.
Yeah. The number of days in the
And it would
next
be
10
humid in Singapore as well too,
Exactly.
so even more dangerous.
Exactly. I mean, we have seen in India, and some people may or may not have read The Ministry of the Future. This is a book which Stanley Robin Johnson actually wrote, and really interesting how it opens up with Indians flocking to the only waterway, and then how it's drying up and people just can't breathe, and because the temperatures are so high. We had that experience in India just this past year. So we are going to have to do both at the same time, mitigate and really continue to think through what mitigation looks like, which means, again, not just investing in those bright, shiny things, but cutting down our emissions from fossil. We have to do that. And by the same token, adapting and ensuring that we adapt fast, putting in place the right infrastructure, ensuring that our cities have more greenery. The best adaptation plan is planting more trees, making more greenery so we can absorb some of this, creating shade for both trees and biodiversity and ecosystems. So we have to do both at the same time. And that's a lot to think through, clearly, but it's the only option.
The next question that I've got is from David Carr, who asks, should Australia learn from Norway with its 78% resources levy versus 5% in Western Australia on gas and iron ore? And should those kinds of levies be raised?
Yes. And this is also what we talk about in the book, which is setting up a fund, a universal basic dividend. You see it in Norway, which is extraordinary, where every year citizens get back some of the money from the extraction of oil and gas. Now, clearly, we don't want continued extraction of oil and gas to funnel the taxpayer and give them actually more money and more funds, because, of course, that just perpetuates the problem. But we do need to put a levy on the current natural resources and the use. And I think what this comes back to, again, is this ethical kind of moral piece. Think about it. Companies are making money out of a resource that actually is everyone's. The way in which the oil and gas sector have been able to continue to extract oil and gas or minerals and privatize it and keep it in their own hands rather than redistributing is really quite ethically immoral. But take it to the next level. And if today we were able to start to truly tax, whether it be the wealthy, as I said, or windfall profits, or the use of natural resources, so that we actually start to create at least hopefully less extraction and place a value on those natural resources, and then put them in the fund. And by the way, Norway is not the only country. The state of Alaska, you would never think this, but is doing the same. And I've actually said, even to President von der Leyen, why not issue a check every year to citizens? You can call it a positive shift check, or you can call it whatever you want, to give people the impetus to either save energy or to actually shift their dependency on certain resources. We got a Trump check. I got a Trump check, which, by the way, I didn't cash in. I gave to an NGO that was anti-fossil. But I also got a check from Biden, the Biden administration, during COVID, which was the COVID check. As an American citizen, we got about $1,000. Each of us. Can you imagine how much that costs at the end of the year? What's important there as well is not just the money, but it's the fact that the citizen all of a sudden feels that the government is thinking about their pain, is actually trying to enable them to get some of the benefits or buffer some of the hardship that they're actually feeling. There's something very symbolic about that. So it's both the redistribution, but it's also the important symbolism of understanding that governments have a responsibility in whatever they do, if they're going to shift towards a just transition fund, towards a universal basic dividend, of ensuring that people's lives and livelihoods are better. And that is the fundamental shift. Can you imagine that leaders these days are not thinking about their citizens? And so many are not. And instead just pocketing the returns, whether they be national sovereign companies, oil and gas, or whether it be other natural resources, or whether it just be corruption overall.
Yeah. It's really interesting because you talked about some of the lessons from the pandemic, and here in Australia, thank you. The government implemented some really massive spending programs to prop up the economy while everything was shut down. And we saw trust in government just went through the roof in the polls, where it's been going down for many years. So there's a democratic dividend as well when people feel like the government is invested in their well-being, I feel like, would be my observation.
Completely. As I said, social tension's going up, distrust is going up. I mean, again, yesterday in my lecture, I have a statistic that just makes me want to throw up, which is that in the United States since 1978, CEO packages have gone up by 1,400%.
Oh.
And yet employees are making 18% more than 1978, and inflation is about 30%.
Yeah.
So distrust has gone through the roof. Hence, you can capture that distrust through fear-mongering. That's why we've got a criminal and a prosecutor up for election, and actually we probably are going to elect a criminal. There's something really scary about that. And I think we need to reverse that trend and come back to some kind of basic humanness and understanding that we need to really focus on people getting better and feeling better in an economy that is servicing them.
Well, I'm afraid we are going to have to wrap it up there. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us. The book that I have here is Earth for All, A Survival Guide for Humanity. You can find it in all good bookshops, and you can check out the website Earth for All online as well. I want to thank everyone for your magnificent questions. As always, I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them. And please join me in thanking Sandrine Dixson-Declève. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to remind you all that this has been recorded, and we'll put it up on our website later this afternoon, as well as on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to subscribe to the Australia Institute's podcast, Follow the Money, Dollars and Cents, and our new podcast, Tracking the American Election After America. You can find that wherever you normally find your podcasts. And a reminder that tomorrow we are speaking to best-selling author Anna Funder about her book Wifedom, and you can find all those details on our website. Thank you again, Sandrine Dixson-Declève. The book is Earth for All, A Survival Guide for Humanity. Thanks so much for joining us today. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified when we publish a new one. See you next time.